So again, if you're just joining us, we're going to just give another minute to give people a chance to get in here, and then we will start. And again, if you're just joining us, we're just giving people about another minute, and then we will be starting. Okay, Alan, I think you could begin.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. I am Alan Mandel, one of the editors of our journal, Prior Learning Assessment Inside Out, PLAO. We are very pleased that you have joined us today for this webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time, whatever time it is in your area. Welcome, welcome, welcome. The first issue of our online journal was actually published in 2012. My longtime colleague Nan Travers and I wanted to find a way to try to bring together those across the world who have been involved in research, practice, and policy making on the assessment of prior learning. We knew at that time that there were more than 40 years of practice behind us and an international PLA, PLAR, VPL, excuse me, another acronym, that a vibrant community that was only growing. PLAO was one effort to extend and deepen our connections with each other and to continue to ask questions about what we are doing, why we are doing what we are doing, and what our next steps might be. After 11 issues and 2 in process, we want to continue. This webinar is one way to do that. We are recording today, and the recording will be available on our PLAO website. At this point in our history, we have 4 editors, Ruud Duvakot, Susan Forcell, Nan Travers, and myself, Associate Editor Carl Burkhardt, and our support person, Alexa Colosides. We are also very thankful for a strong advisory board that has helped to guide our work. We always welcome new contributors and participants. At this moment, I just want to welcome my dear colleague, Nan Travers, who's going to offer some words of background to our webinar today, focused on the theme, Recognizing All Learners, Inclusion and Exclusion in the Recognition of Prior Learning. Thanks again so much to everyone for being here. Nan?
Thank you so much. And we'll go to the next slide. So what I wanted to share with you is a little bit of background in terms of where we are today and how we've gotten here, and then also thinking about where we're going with this. A year ago in May, we had the 5th VPL Biennale. It's a every 2-year conference. And the theme was People, Validation, and Power, Democracy in Action. And that took place in Kilkenny, Ireland. We had over 90 sessions, 370 participants from reaching across all the continents and many, many countries. What was important about this gathering was this question, democracy in action. We were able to really think about and explore concepts around power, how the people who we are touching, and ways in which we are practicing validation and having policies and support around being able to recognize what people know and can do. The part that was so striking was that we really developed a community of conversation. And we asked ourselves, how can we keep the conversation going? And so one way that we decided to keep the conversation going was to create this special issue for Playo, which was our 11th one. And this has just come out. And in this, we have a collection of writings that come from the presentations that were at the conference, the Biennale. They're very significant pieces, and I do encourage everybody to really look at them as they continue to raise this whole question about people, validation, and power, and wondering about democracy in action, thinking about how do we really expand the concept of recognition? Who gets recognized? Who does not get recognized? And how do we start to really think about the ways in which we recognize people? Fully recognize, partially recognize, misrecognize, ignoring, completely non-recognition, and really thinking about how do we shift our conversations to be thinking about the role of recognition in our society. That then led us to really be thinking about this webinar. And as you already know, the title, Recognizing All Learners as a Question, and then thinking about inclusion and exclusion in the recognition of prior learning. When we start to think about the power that we all hold when we start to recognize another person, we have to be thinking about the ways in which we are inclusive and keep aware of ways that we might unintentionally be excluding. And so really thinking about that, the ways in which we recognize who are we saying belong and who are we saying do not belong, and how do we start to think about closing that gap between those that don't get recognized. As our world continues to change and we have so many people who are excluded, we need to rethink the ways in which we start to approach recognition and really thinking about what that recognition means for all people. And so today we hear from 4 people that each have been looking at these questions of inclusion and exclusion. After today, we want to continue the conversation, and that's why this slide shows another arrow with nothing underneath it. At the end, Alan will talk a little bit about some of our future plans, but it's also the 3 dots, keeping the conversation going with 3 dots, really means that we're not going to end this conversation. We're hoping to have additional webinars, and there'll be additional issues of Playo, but also a 6th VPL Biennale and other ways that we can get together and really be thinking about this from a very serious place in terms of what are the messages that we give people when we recognize them or don't recognize them, and what are ways that we can evolve recognition as we move into the future. And so with that, I'm going to turn back to my colleague, Alan, who will introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Nan. We're really delighted. We're very honored to have 4 guests who will offer us perspectives on their practices, challenges, and plans. Our four guests are Agnes Witzani from the Agency for Quality Assurance and Accreditation in Austria, Lana from Athabasca University in Canada, Ossama Saleh from the National Authority for Quality Assurance and Accreditation of Education in Egypt, and Ernesto Villalba-Garcia from the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training. Each of our colleagues will offer about 8 or 10 minutes. Our co-editor, Susan Forcell, will open up some questions. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to make comments and offer your questions in the chat, not the Q&A, but the chat that we will get to after Susan offers her questions. Our colleague, Associate Editor Carl Burkhardt, will read those questions. Welcome again, everybody. Thank you for being here. We turn to Agnes Witzani for her opening talk. Thanks a million.
Right. Thank you very much, Alan. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. It is really an honor to be invited to this very first Plio webinar. And I was actually at the Biennale last year in Ireland and remember it very fondly and remember a very positive energy coming with the topic of including all learners. And I already had the pleasure to promote the European RPL network there, and I will talk today about RPL in higher education in Europe. But first of all, my name is Agnes Witzani. As already said, I work at the Austrian Quality Assurance Agency in Austria. And our main task, of course, is to conduct external quality assurance procedures, but we have other tasks as well. Amongst those are the coordination of the Austrian RPL network, and we are a founding member of the European RPL network. And I'm here today on behalf of the European RPL network. I'm in the coordinating committee, and I'm happy today to speak to you about RPL in Europe in higher education and the role that networks play in the implementation of RPL in higher education on a European level and on a national level. And if I have time, I will give you some insights into challenges in the Austrian situation as well, but mainly focus on what networks can do for the implementation. And I will finish my talk with a few selected recommendations on implementation of RPL in higher education, which I believe are really of great importance when we talk about including and especially reaching all learners and recognizing all forms of learning. Next slide, please. Yes, so we were asked in the beginning to state clearly like which context we come from, because it's great to hear that there are so many people from around the world in different contexts, and different acronyms are used for what we are talking about. And you already see in my slide that I talk about RPL, recognition of prior learning. When we use that term, we talk about the recognition of non-formal and informal learning in the higher education context. So when recognizing non-formal and informal learning, a validation procedure is necessary in higher education institutions to recognize such learning. So we can also talk about the validation of non-formal and informal learning, which will use equivalent. I'm not going into details what a validation procedure is. I'm sure that the community is well aware of that. I do want to stress the point that when we also talk about RPL, we talk about two forms. About recognizing prior learning for access to a study program or course, and for recognizing prior learning for credits within a study program or course. And this is already one aspect that differs across Europe a lot. For example, in Austria, it is very common to recognize non-formal and informal learning for credits, but there's only limited possibility to recognize non-formal and informal learning for access. In other countries in Europe, it's totally the opposite. So we always have to really say what we're talking about. And this is, of course, already a challenge when we talk about Europe. Because, yeah, Europe, or a lot of different countries are part of Europe, and even more are part of the European higher education area. So we talk about a lot of different legal frameworks in the European higher education area, and so different contexts. But there are many policies on a European level as well as national levels with the same, I would say, same or common idea for the European higher education area, to make it, to improve permeability, to enable flexible pathways and improve lifelong learning. And in all those aspects, RPL has a central role and is part of many policies in Europe. So contexts are diverse. The goal seems to be the same, and we do have common challenges that we found in the discussions that we have on the network on the European level. It seems that RPL is when you read policies, it seems that RPL is a normal part in higher education, as implemented throughout the higher education systems. But what we see that actually in practice, implementation in higher education is in many countries quite slow. So we identify a bridge from policy to practice, that there is a gap still. And why is that? In discussions, we see that really to recognize all learning for higher education institutions, that requires often a shift in mindset. So this is a cultural shift, a cultural change is often needed. And one of the biggest challenges is still to gain trust in RPL procedures in higher education. And to gain trust, we believe the quality assured procedures, of course, and the collaboration between all stakeholders is essential. So that's the key to talk about networks. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. We founded the European RPL network together with I think it was 15 other countries and national initiatives 2 years ago. And it is an association of national networks. So the basic idea was to connect the national initiatives on RPL in Europe with the aim to learn from each other and to support the work on the national levels. I think the beauty is that the network connects people from the policy level, like European institutions, agencies, and so on, with the practical level, because the national networks, they are made out of the higher education institutions. Practitioners are part of the national networks, and individual experts from higher education institutions are also part of the networks. So it is really a place where policy and practice can come together, and we can work on those common challenges that we have. Yeah. Of course, one main focus of the network is also to raise awareness for RPL in higher education and to promote its use. We do that also with events, and had a conference last year and are planning another conference for next November. So now I put here the links to our the website and our LinkedIn page, which we are trying to be quite active on. And please follow this for more information. Next slide, please. Yes, I will not go into detail now into a situation in Austria, because I'm only have a few minutes left. What is important at a national level, of course, the context is more similar. And in Europe, I think it is a good idea to set up national networks to connect the practitioners in the higher education institutions to really be able to give peer support to each other and see what the challenges are there. Because I said before, yeah, the political will also in Austria, the situation is quite clear. We have a legal framework that enables RPL in higher education for all sectors, but the question of implementation still holds a lot of challenges, and this is where networks can support institutions really with their implementation. We talked about trust, that it is important to gain trust in RPL, to raise awareness for the impact, the positive impact that RPL has, not only on the individual, but also for society. And to gain trust in an institution and to take steps towards implementing RPL in higher education institutions. We believe that building an RPL-friendly culture in the higher education institutions is very important. This is one of the implementation aspects that we have been discussing a lot in the networks. And I just referenced here a recent publication from one of the experts from the network, Susanna Boldrino. Next slide. Thank you. So finally, I just want to summarize some points that I believe are of great importance when it comes to recognizing all forms of learning, especially non-formal and informal learning in higher education. So institutions need to have a positive attitude towards RPL and be committed to really include all learners. And that often requires a cultural change in higher education. As said, trust is a basis for such a positive attitude towards RTL and the commitment of all stakeholders. And I'm sure that quality assured procedures and especially transparent procedures can help building trust. Yes, transparency is key. Transparency in communication, of course, also transparency in criteria for validation, and transparency in having someone who is responsible for RPL in an institution. So these are now just some aspects that I believe are relevant in order to reach all learners that want to be reached, and really make the implementation of RPL in higher education a normality, like it seems in many policies. And I believe that networks can play a crucial role in that, in bridging the policy to practice gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Agnes. We really appreciate that. And again, I'm sorry, we seem to be having a little problem here with the chat, which we hope to figure out, but you can put your comments in the Q&A at this moment. We now would like to welcome Lana from Athabasca University in Canada. Welcome, Lana.
Miigwech. And I think one more click will bring up the, yeah, perfect. Back one, please. Bojo waskanigija gokindigo, jau kanoje nadodam apoganisna nadunjaba shuni and da. So as mentioned, my name is Lana Ray. I'm a Anishinaabe Kwe from the northern shores of Lake Superior, located in Ontario, Canada. And so the work that I do is a educator working within Indigenous contexts, and specifically many of the times within Anishinaabe contexts. So what I'm speaking about today is some highlights, some critical conversations from a discussion paper that we had released in November 2024. And so we could provide the link for that if there's any interest as well. So regarding Indigenous PLAR, there's a pretty significant gap in terms of the literature. There's only a few resources. So the project was really about trying to really explore the question of what is an Indigenous PLAR and why do we even want to pursue Indigenous PLAR? And we do know from the literature that does exist, PLAR is very scant within Indigenous contexts, within post-secondary institutions. And one recent study in 2020 in the United States found that for Black and Indigenous adult students, PLAR was severely underutilized. So it kind of begs the question, we know in Indigenous contexts, there's a need for access to education. PLAR really emerged as in the discourse of access, and everyone has the right to learn and for their knowledge to be acknowledged. So then why has there been an underutilization of PLAR in this context, and also in the context in Canada when there's increasing conversations to the inclusion of Indigenous content and implementation of Indigenous content within post-secondary institutions? Next slide, please. So I just wanted to frame the conversation a little bit more when we're talking about exclusion within Indigenous contexts. So exclusion, right, we're essentially talking about when folks experience disadvantage, which is structural due to social infrastructure, perceptions and behavioral processes, societal outcomes, lack of meaningful connection. And so when we're talking about exclusion in Indigenous context and in the context of institutions, we know institutions play a significant role in regard to inclusion or exclusion, right? Institutions have a role of normalization, of socializations. So they have regulatory, normative, and cultural cognitive elements within them. So they're responsible really for creating a meaningful social within a particular nation or state. Now, when we're thinking about the relationship between institutions in a Canadian context, but also in other settler colonial states and exclusion, we need to make sure we broaden that conversation and account for settler colonialism. So when we're talking about settler colonialism, we're really talking about the erasure of Indigenous peoples, of Indigenous knowledge systems as a way to ensure the legitimacy of the state of settlers. So it's about erasure of nationhood, membership, and identity. So when we're talking about exclusion, we need to see exclusion as a particular mechanism and circumstance of settler colonialism. Next slide. And I'm just going to pick out a couple of key pieces. This is a slide talking about dimensions of settler colonial power, just to further frame some of the conversation. So one of the dimensions is ideological justification for Indigenous dispossession. So we see this on an ongoing basis, right? The marginalization of Indigenous knowledges, as well as Indigenous communities themselves as sites of real valid knowledge. That there's different mechanisms for eliminating or transferring Indigenous nations and populations out of existence, and institutions playing a significant role in that through particular techniques of exclusion, assimilation, etc. The role of cultural appropriation. So how much does the state actually consume of indigeneity and project authority over? And then that goes to the denial and elimination of possible alternatives. So even back to our question, why do we not see more instances of Indigenous PLAR? Next slide. So in some of the work that we did, we created a series of models, and going back to those settler colonial dimensions, often, so what you're seeing here shows the tenets of Indigenous knowledges, kind of the assumptions of PLAR, and how PLAR kind of relates to the institution. And predominantly what we see is an emphasis on the student success piece, which is important, but again, it reinforces that one-way knowledge flow, right, of kind of deficit students, institutions. We need to get them in these Western institutions. But as you can see from this slide, there's also great possibilities for Indigenous PLAR and Indigenous understanding to forward goals of institutions themselves regarding pedagogical innovation, as well as to actually pursue the commitments they say that they want to uphold around community recognition of Indigenous knowledges and having Indigenous-centered approaches to indigenization. Next slide. So this next model is really just kind of highlighting or delving deeper into the point that I just made. When we're thinking about PLAR in Indigenous contexts, we need to understand PLAR assumptions, practices, and relationship to community. Within Indigenous context, to be able to create PLAR that's meaningful to not only Indigenous learners to provide culturally responsive education, but to actually acknowledge how this is also very beneficial to institutions forwarding their goals around reconciliation, experiential learning, and other aspects of pedagogical innovation. Next slide. And I'm just returning to those settler colonial assumptions, and I wanted to touch on the point of cultural appropriation quickly. So when there was 3 sections to the report. One was on really trying to understand what might be points of equivalency. And there was very little literature or examples of, right, community-based recognized PLAR. But what we found, Indigenous knowledges was recognized in the form of community building participation, especially culture, language, and land-based. When it came to institutions, creating, curating educational experiences for settler students. So again, it begs the question, why, when it's through kind of this process of institutional ownership and control, do we see a recognition of Indigenous knowledges predominantly for settlers, but there's a lack of recognition for Indigenous learners who are, many times in the community doing that work daily, monthly. It's entrenched within their families, within their communities, and we don't recognize that work. So this is just demonstrating some areas where equivalency could be recognized. Next slide. And I won't touch on this too much, but I just wanted to bring to folks' attention that we also discussed assessment in the discussion paper. And again, the importance of Indigenous control regarding assessment and principles and practices that are grounded in Indigenous knowledge systems and community as a way to recognize Indigenous knowledges. Next slide. So I will just leave it there, miigwech, and maybe as the next speaker is talking, I will look up that that link for the discussion paper and include it in the chat.
Super. Lana, thank you so much. Just again, a little comment is that your questions and comments could be placed in the Q&A, and we will get to them after everybody has had a chance to speak. So thanks, Lana. We'd now like to turn to our colleague, Ossama Saleh, from the National Authority of Quality Assurance and Accreditation of Education in Egypt. Ossama, welcome.
Welcome, everybody. It's very nice to be with you today. I have a very little story compared with the comprehensive experience I heard here. I'm working for the National Authority for Quality Assurance and Accreditation of Education in Egypt, NAQA. NAQA was established as an education quality assurance and accreditation body 2007 as a part of the education reform strategy of Egypt. NAQA plays a crucial role in ensuring quality of education by developing accreditation standards, providing guidance and support. In a more detailed look, NAQA roles are setting and reviewing quality standards, promoting culture quality, evaluating education institution, providing guidance and support, and capacity building. In 2022, establishment of Egyptian National Qualification Framework becomes part of NAQA's responsibility. And one of the main goals of Egyptian National Qualification Framework is the development of a national system for recognition of prior learning. I started working with NAQA very early at 2009 as a member of the President Technical Office. One of the main tasks was the development of National Qualification Framework with a special attention to RPL. As a part of the National Qualification Framework project prepared by the Technical Office, I prepared the first proposal for RPL in Egypt. It was a very simple proposal, just to introduce the idea for the community. Later, in 2018, more detailed policy paper was prepared within the frame of TVET project, a technical and vocational education and training project in Egypt, co-funded by the Egyptian government and the European Union. 2020 and 2021, I prepared a study for UNESCO entitled Recognition, Validation, and Accreditation, RVA practices in Egypt, with focus on migrant and refugees. Later on, in 2022, I became NAQA President Advisor for National Qualification Framework and a member of the Supreme Advisory Committee for the National Qualification Framework, which includes representative of a number of expertise representing 10 ministers concerned with Egyptian National Qualification Framework, and their main roles include implementation of National Qualification Framework and its main tools, including RPL. Currently, Egypt does not have a national RPL system, legalization, or regulation that enable institutions either in the labor market or in the educational sector to develop mechanism and arrangement for recognition of non-formal and informal learning outcomes and competences. But in the same time, some RPL practices can be seen, and some of them can be applied for immigrant and refugees. Attention for migrants and refugees is very important. Egypt have more than 10 millions of refugees that live here in Egypt. As an example for RPL in the education sector, we have literacy program for adult above school age, started from the age of 20 and above. If the applicant know how to read and write, they can directly set for adult education certificate exam. If not, they go through the nine-month adult education course, and then he is ready for the exam. This certificate is essential to work in any governmental place or even to have a driving license. Refugee children can enroll in Egyptian public school, but due to problems like difficulties in transportation, need to work, or overcrowded school, they didn't attend the school classes, but attend class in NGOs run or community centers in a culturally familiar environment with native teachers who speaks a familiar dialect. They have the opportunity to sit end of year and school leaving exam. Another example for refugees is when they can be assessed or pass through a leveling exam before being placed in appropriate class in schools. In labor sector, it's much harder to trace RPL practices in the Egyptian labor sector. This might be due to many causes: the large size of the informal labor market, difficulty and high cost process to obtain work permit in Egypt for non-Egyptian, of course. One of the very few RPL practices in the labor market is an official exam conducted by Ministry of Manpower, known as Skill Measurement Certificate Test. This certificate is essential for workers to work inside formal labor market. According to the exam level, the applicant is classified into worker with limited skill or skillful worker who can perform activities that require knowledge and skills in a wide range of technical activities. It's clearly obvious that in absence of national qualification framework, we are just started this year, policies for recognition, this does not exist yet, counseling service, flexible education and training system, and legal framework in action, RPL practices are very difficult to exist. At the same time, the few RPL practices in Egypt aren't without some points of strength. It nearly extends to all levels, pre-university education and even literacy program, and it appears that the RPL policies for school students have led to reasonable results for refugees. For example, the majority, 69% of refugee children aged 6 to 17 years were attending school. Attendance rate were highest among Sudanese, 92%, Syrian, 89%, South Sudanese, 87%, and the Iraqi refugees, 82%. Although skill measurement certificate isn't available to migrants and refugees till now, but in the same time, it's a very important step to empower the transition toward the formal labor market. On the other hand, some weak points can't be ignored. One of the most important obstacles facing recognition seeker is the lack of single method for obtaining recognition. There are several methods that differ from one practice to another. In most of cases, the process takes place through multiple steps in different places and without a link between these parties, and in the absence of a real guidance and support. The service applicant is completely self-reliant, and the matter becomes more difficult if the applicant is a foreign citizen and non-Arabic speaker. As a communication problem, it has nothing to do with the race or the nationality. Success of current and future RPL practice in Egypt depends on multiple action needed. The most important of them, these actions start with the education and the training those in charge of the process of citizen or refugees, how important that what they do to serve seeker and migrants, and the importance of this humanitarian role to support the right of these groups to education, work, and to live normal life, to help them overcome the problem they experience, and this rule may be still absent. Also, building on an information system that provides applicants with sufficient information to help them make a sound decision in order to make the best use of the available opportunities. Moreover, a great offer is needed to gain community confidence in the skills required outside the formal framework for education and training. Also, the whole system has to be changed from process-centered into individual-centered with true and complete stakeholder coordination. Another point that has to be considered during building the Egyptian RPL system is that Egypt is a labor exporting country and at the same time a transient country for migrants to Europe. Therefore, the developed system must take into account stakeholder needs and standards applied in the country of final destination or arrival for workers or migrants. And thank you.
Ossama, thank you so much for your presentation. Just a little comment that, as many have noticed, the chat is now in operation. So your questions and comments can be placed there, and we will get to them after our four speakers. Our fourth speaker is Ernesto Villalba-Garcia from the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training. Welcome so much, Ernesto.
Thank you, Alan. Hello, everyone. Really an honor to be here. And, you know, we have heard already quite different stories in a way. And I think that is the richness of this community, really. And again, thank you to Alan and Nan for organizing it, because I think that this is the point that we need to kind of come together to kind of try to finding commonalities in these different stories. So what I'm going to try to do, actually, well, I want to kind of give in this introduction basically a little bit of a presentation of what we do at where I work. So as Alan said, I work for the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training. CEDEFOP is a decentralized agency of the European Union. This means our governing board is composed of representatives of government, employers, and trade union organizations from all the member states. So we are not the European Commission, but we work very closely together with the Commission in developing policies on vocational education and training, skills and qualifications. We are located in Greece, in Thessaloniki. Since 1995 is our 50th anniversary. Here it is, 15th anniversary. We have been working on the issues of recognition of prior learning. We usually refer to it as validation of non-formal and informal learning for 20 years now, working together with the Commission. And we have helped in a way to develop several policies connected to validation. Maybe the most relevant one is the 2012 recommendation of the Council, where basically all the member states of the European Union agreed that they will develop systems of validation by 2018. And there are two main strains of work that we follow. I mean, besides doing research and studies, we also have supported the Commission developing European guidelines on validation of non-formal and informal learning, and I will talk a little bit about them now. And we have also developed the European inventory on validation. I will go into two of these. And very recently, we have bring those two together in an information hub that, as I say, I will just briefly present what they are, and then we'll go into the topic of today, basically exclusion and inclusion, a little bit on the results of the inventory, if I have a little bit of time for it. I have to check the time. The European guidelines are, as I say, they try to kind of bring a blueprint of what we believe should be the approach to validation in Europe, in a way. But because, as Agnes very well say, there are very different systems, very different legal bases, very different starting points, we cannot be prescriptive. So what the guidelines try to do is really give the questions, in a way, the themes, the areas that are important to reflect upon when you are developing, implementing, or using validation systems within Europe. They are divided into different chapters. And as I say, the main thing is to have different questions in each of these aspects. And we try to kind of have a strategic approach, that these are the two first chapters, and then a little bit of an approach where we try to go into the specific elements of provision and methodologies. The thing that I want to highlight here, and I think Agnes and some others have mentioned it too, is the importance of the individual at the end. It is very important that what we are emphasizing over and over again, and I want to emphasize it also here, is that what we have to create the system is for the individual. So the individual has to be at the center, and all these elements of provision, all these strategic aspects have to kind of consider how they affect the individual, that at the end has to benefit from recognizing or validating their knowledge and skills. So this is fundamental, I think, in order to understand also this idea of inclusion and exclusion, because at the end of the day, we want to include everybody. We have to think of that everybody, and I talk about everybody, and I think also Lana's presentation was very clear on including everybody. So these questions, in a way, and as I say, what we want is that each country in the European Union will answer the questions in different ways. We try to see in what way those questions are being answered in regular updates of the European inventory and validation. We cover all the European countries, all the European Union countries, and also some neighboring countries with our sister agency, the European Training Foundation in Turin, that works together with countries like Egypt, Turkey, some other countries, neighboring countries. So we have reports about all these countries. We try to get a comprehensive view of what is happening in the countries, covering not only education and training, but also aspects of validation or recognition of prior learning that occurs in the labor market context. So where Chamber of Commerce or sectoral associations, sectoral industrial associations are kind of developing their own systems of recognition or validation, and also in the third sector where voluntary associations or civil society organizations are also doing a lot of work on validation of non-formal and informal learning within their activities. And we have this focus on reports, let's say country reports, but we also have specific thematic areas and specific case studies in each of the editions. And what we have done now very recently in March is to put the guidelines and the inventory together, trying to kind of allow people to a better peer learning and kind of learn on those specific aspects. So what we try to do is that if you are interested in one specific question, one specific area, you can go and look at it. So when we put this together, and of course invite you to have a look and give us feedback, the idea is that the guidelines are there, as I say, the questions, the framework, and then you can go into each of these aspects of the framework and see how the countries are giving an answer to that specific aspect, and even compare with other countries that you might consider close. So there is that possibility of peer learning that Agnes was talking about, no? Because at the end of the day, what we want is that the European countries learn from each other. But as it has been said, there is many different actors, many different parts of the system. And that's what I want to go, if I have 3 more minutes maybe, into the results of what we have found in the last inventory update. So this was done in 2023. The inventory is a long process. It takes around 2 years, where we work together with the member states through the European Qualification Framework Advisory Group. They give us inputs. They help us to make sure that the reports that we are creating are quality assured. And so these country reports that I was talking about are developed by specific experts that know about what is happening in the country through consultations, literature reviews. And what we have found in the last inventory is that, you know, at the European level, and Agnes was referring to it, there are systems of validation in place. The legal bases are there to some extent, and that graph shows the number of countries of 32 that are covered at the EU that have some sort of validation system. But what we are seeing is that these different systems, these different arrangements are not necessarily well connected. There is also, there has been an increase in the labor market relevance, meaning there's a lot of activity in the labor market. So Chamber of Commerce, sector associations are creating more and more systems. And I think this is, of course, associated with the shortage of labor that the EU is experiencing. And one thing that we also see positive, let's say, is that the national qualification frameworks are being used, are being linked to connect those systems of validation. So the qualifications that are in those national qualification frameworks usually are able to be accessed or awarded through validation. However, it seems, and this was pointed out to what Agnes said also, it seems that access is a little bit more difficult than awarding credits, let's say. So basically, and again, this talks about exclusion and inclusion, you want somebody to already be at certain level in order to get to you, to your level of education, to your program. And unless he has that level already, you are not going to accept the validation of non-formal informal. So you only start validation or you start recognition when that person has already passed certain threshold. And we see this also that there is a limited outreach and use of validation. So there is a need for more awareness raising campaigns, the people understanding, and Agnes was saying also that need of, and I think that need of building the trust, building the community really. And I think the network such as the European network is fundamental. The Biennale, these kind of events are fundamental for combating that fragmented provision that we are seeing, where we need to kind of, if the systems need to be different, the arrangements have to be different, at least there has to be coherent across all those different arrangements and provisions that exist. And I think that the use of ICT in the next years is going to be fundamental for this. What we see in the 2023 inventory is that there's not enough of that use, we think. And we believe that is kind of one of the possibilities of the future. So basically, a little bit as Agnes was saying, I think one of the fundamental aspects will be to work from that kind of rhetoric and kind of the idea that the policies are there into the implementation. And one aspect of the implementation that will be crucial, and this is the topic of today in a way, will be how do we make sure that that implementation takes everybody into account and not only a few. That is what it seems to be the case in most of the places that we are looking at. So thank you very much.
Ernesto, thank you very, very much. Very, very much. We now turn to our other co-editor, Susan Forcell, who will start us off with questions. Please, we can get to this upcoming PLAO issue at a later point. Susan.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I'd like to do land acknowledgement. And in Canada, land acknowledgements show our understanding, our place in the history, and our understanding of the peoples that were here from time immemorial before us. So I'll start by sharing, today I'm very proud to come from the land of the Tk'emlúps-te-Secwépemc, and that is in the central interior of what is now known as British Columbia, Canada. They have been exceptional stewards of this land for thousands and thousands of years, and I am privileged today to be living and working and learning on their territories. So now to the matter at hand. As I was listening to each of the presentations, there were some themes that came forward, and the concept of power and the exploration of, I wrote this down so I wouldn't forget and I wouldn't butcher it, but to go to Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, the philosopher, where he talks about the power that the power that we hold to maintain the existing social order. And whether that's in education, whether that's in government, whether that's in throughout our everyday lives, that's what I heard today, is the question about how do we use this power that we have to be more inclusive, to be more inclusive of the various peoples and the knowledges that they have. So that's a very long way of me asking, how can we ensure that the principles of fairness, equity, and accessibility are upheld throughout the RPL processes. And I'll make that just a little bit simpler. What is it that we can do to go back to what Ernesto just shared to take everybody's learning into account? And I'd like to start with order of the presenters. So Agnes, could you say a few words of what your team, your organization, or a best practice that you've heard of taking different learners' experiences into account and how this might upset the existing social order?
Thank you, Susan.
Question. Yeah.
Yeah, well, what do we do to ensure that all learners are reached? Of course, we, as a quality assurance agency, we facilitate the exchange in the network. So we have the mandate to inform and consult on matters of RPL. Which sounds a bit technical, which basically means that we give room to the topic and we give visibility and awareness. And I talked a lot in my talk about how to bridge from policy to practice, but I think the other way around is also important. So if I go back, like in the Austrian case, about 10 years, we had a lot of projects together with higher education institutions to include the people really working in institutions in projects. And we worked on how to implement RPL and how to set rules, set regulations. And in higher education, well, we do depend on law, and it is formal education. So there is a legal ground that we have to work with. And actually, all those work we could feed into a change of law in 2021, which enabled us to really make RPL, at least from a legal point of view, possible in higher education in all sectors, and give EQ Austria the possibility to promote and raise awareness. And what we now really can do, I will cut it short, probably have the possibility to talk again, now is to give room, give visibility, but also look at and work on our language. We have a very technical language in quality assurance, in higher education, a very legal language, of course. And that's what I meant with a cultural shift and with an attitude as well, that also the institutions look at how do we talk with learners and how do we address them. So I think that's an issue that we should focus on even more and make RPL understandable to reach learners.
Thank you, Agnes. It was really good to hear that and to hear what Austria is doing and the legislation that's been put in place. Lana, over to you. In terms of the existing social order in Canada and how our education systems have been largely designed to maintain that social order, what would be your advice to opening that up to Indigenous learners?
Yeah, I think to start is thinking about the framework or the context. So why I introduced settler colonialism is to really bring it back to that nation-to-nation framework. So when we're talking about PLAR, yes, there's concepts of inclusion and diversity, but we also need to acknowledge that a distinct, recognized right for Anishinaabe people, First Nations people, to learn from their own knowledge systems. And this is often, Indigenous content is often framed in Canada anyways, in the context of reconciliation. And for folks who don't know, right, Canada had a ongoing history of implementing Indian residential schools across the nation. Many Anishinaabe children didn't come home, were removed from their families, were treated, very violently. Our last residential school closed in 1996, and that was all about access to land, trying to disintegrate our knowledge systems, our connections, our relationships. So a lot of the work around Indigenous education, even Indigenous PLAR, Indigenous content happens under the auspice of reconciliation. However, if we go back to some of those historical agreements, which are legal and binding and still standing. An underlying understanding in many of the treaties was that there would be kind of a co-learning from one another. And we're still not seeing that. So we've jumped ahead talking about reconciliation, but Canada still isn't meeting, and institutions, settler institutions, still aren't doing their job in meeting basic requirements of the historical agreement, let alone moving towards reconciliation. So I just wanted to preface, because I think that provides the necessary context for my response. So when we're thinking about then unsettling power and working in Indigenous context, I think it's always the question of, right, like, how is this actually acknowledging? So how do we build up or support communities versus extraction, even though sometimes it seems very nuanced in what that looks like. So what are working in partnership? And I think Agnes did a good job of talking about when we work in network and partnership, what could be potential in it being a strength. So institutions more so thinking less of their role as, right, kind of the gatekeepers of knowledge, the authority of knowledge. But if there truly is about a love of learning and exploration, the best way for institutions to grow and support that is to do that in partnership. So working in partnership with Indigenous communities around, and there's examples in the report that I shared of how can communities build their own knowledge, modules or center around the experiences they want. We have, right, positions that are fairly straightforward and consistent across Canada, or at least across the province, where there could be equivalence mapping done to acknowledge that. So PLAR, I think, is, right, still not community First Nation Institute of Learning that's fully governed, but it definitely is a bridge and a step in the right direction for institutions to relinquish some power, that stance of being the authority, and work in meaningful partnership.
Thank you. I'd love to spend more time talking about the relinquishing of power. Ossama, over to you. In terms of taking everybody's learning into account, and that recognized and that unrecognized learning, what advice would you have to support the those that are maybe on the peripheral, and what would be your advice for challenging the existing social order?
Oh, I have to start that we don't have a real system till now here in Egypt. All what we do is very sporadic experience or methods to gain recognition of the available. Our main goal is to increase the size of the formal labor market, because more than 50% of the Egyptian economy is outside the formal labor market. And this is a great challenge because there is problem with taxes, there is problem of assuring a good life for the workers. First, we are thinking about how to build a system that is comprehensive and inclusive for all the member of the society. The challenge, not only in the Egyptian citizen, the real challenge here in Egypt is the 10 millions of refugees that live now in Egypt. Most of them, they don't have any possibility to enter the formal labor market because it's a very difficult process in Egypt, and it's very expensive in the same time. This, of course, because we have a very, very large population. We have 110 million Egyptians live here in Egypt, and the market is very narrow or very challenging to enter. In the same time, these number of refugees. Most of them are living in Egypt without registration. They only live in the streets. Because the nature of this huge number, they are from Arabic countries, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Southern Sudan. Most of them are very used to live here in Egypt without recognition or registration by any refugee authority or organization. So they live here in Egypt, enter the labor market without any registration, without any measurements of the skill they have. This is the real challenge that face Egypt. We need to increase the size of the formal market to make the entrance for the labor market very organized, and then we have to have a measure to recognize the skills and even the certificates they carry with them when they come to Egypt. It's a very difficult process. We don't have enough knowledge. We don't have enough data about them. And this is why we started our project for recognition of prior learning. It's a very difficult process, we know, and it's very challenging. And this is why I'm with you to gain the experience from your models of work in different areas in the world. And I hope, and I'm very, very thankful for you, because I get a lot of points that will help us to start our work. As an Egyptians, we don't have really margination or even segregation of the community. Most of Egyptians are the same colors, same religion. They don't have this challenge that could be found in other countries. The real challenge are the refugees and the lack of data about them. And although don't have refugee camps and they live very free here in Egypt, but it will be better to be incorporated in a formal process rather than this bizarre or even haphazard working environment. And this is a really challenge.
Thank you very much for that. Ernesto, I'm going to shift it a little bit, and then after Ernesto, we're going to go into the chat and ask some specific questions to expand the conversation. Ernesto, you've been working in this field across Europe and internationally for many years now. What are some of or is there one really good example that comes to mind that that we've been working hard to challenge the social order through RPL? How do we support those people on the peripheral and help their knowledges be accessed? And what did I read most recently? There's 122.6 displaced people around the world right now. So is there any one example, Ernesto, that comes to you?
Well, I think there are a lot of examples where a lot of countries are trying to do a lot of things, especially with displaced people. And I think that outside Europe, in fact, there might be even more important examples. And some of the work that UNESCO, the Institute of Lifelong Learning, is doing, maybe some of the colleagues are here, and also the ILO is doing fantastic work in looking at this kind of things. So there are quite a lot of examples, I would say. But what I wanted to emphasize with this thing of inclusion in general is that at the end of the day, one important aspect is the, let's say, making sure that, we have, it is fundamental to think of the objective at the end of the day of that process of the recognition or validation of whatever you're going to call it. But at the end of the day, is what is the objective of getting that recognition? Because as we have seen now from the examples that we are looking at, it is very different to accept, let's say, a full body of knowledge from indigenous people, kind of accepted it as a, let's say, formalized. So if you want, coming to another formal, that to get somebody that we want to work in a specific sector and give him a qualification that will give him access to a certain job. They are very different processes. They are all important in a way, and are all related to this idea of valuing learning, valuing skills, let's say. And I think that there is where we need to kind of make sure that, again, looking at the individual, making those processes that are able to adapt to the needs of the individual. And I think that is the crucial aspect. How do we get that adaptability of a system that needs to meet so many complex things? And I think some people in the chat were talking about how we need to kind of accept that companies, for example, are also recognizing to some extent the skills. Of course, when they are recruiting people, they are doing some sort of recognition or validation of the skills. So all these different processes, I think, and I keep saying this over and over again, what we need to try to find out is that common understanding, coherence of all these different processes. And the only way to do this is precisely by creating these communities of practice, creating these places where people can talk about where to go with, and there's going to be always, I think, a power struggle. And I think you see it very clearly with higher education institutions not wanting to accept learning that has been acquired in vocational training or outside the formal system sometimes. So there are, I mean, there's always like the formal system is going to be against in many ways to what other systems of learning are going to happen. So we need to build that consensus and kind of, I think, all on the same ground. And that's the difficult part. How do we make sure that everybody's at the same level and not one with overpower the other? But the key, I think, and I finish with this, that I'm taking too long. The key, again, is the individual. What is that the individual want? Because if the individual is not interested in getting into a formal qualification and he just wants a job, or he wants a job, or he wants or she wants to get an understanding of what his knowledge capacities are, maybe we need a different process that is coherent with other processes that are more formalized. Or that I end, and I see that Lana has.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ernesto. Lana, it looks like you wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to maybe build off what Ernesto said, and also the concept, I think, like the recognition of Indigenous knowledge and qualifications are also very much interrelated. So, right, we're thinking about what skills, what knowledges are actually required to make you qualified. And I didn't go into the methodology of the study, but we talked to 13 practitioners of Indigenous knowledge. And one of the people who we spoke to, they actually had a process where they were utilizing PLAR for students to gain access into a master's program. And what they were seeing is that there was Anishinaabe people working in organizations, Indigenous organizations, but because they didn't have that qualification, they were being paid less for their work, even though they had a ton of experience. And there was often non-Anishinaabe people who didn't have all that experience, community relations, all of those pieces, but had a master's degree, who would then come in leadership positions and at a higher pay range. So yeah, just the two, I think there's definitely an interconnection there.
I think that interconnection, the holistic view of the policies, the principles, the practices, the pedagogy, the philosophy, they're all entangled. And that is part, I'll go back to what Nan said at the very beginning. She introduced us. We hold power, we can influence change, and those all come together to help with that. Going through the chat, there are a number of threads, and I wanted to pull on one of those right now. And that was just going to go to you, Agnes. We were behind the scenes, Agnes and I were talking about some of the questions that were designed or asked of her. And one of the things that you asked, Agnes, is how to communicate to learners the RPL possibilities. And I guess that would be one of the threads, is to work with the, back to what you just said, Ernesto, is to what is the objective of recognition? And that objective can be so different for the candidate, for the organization, for the government, for society on whole. But how do we communicate to the learner, specifically the RPL possibilities? Agnes, was there anything you wanted to comment on with that?
Yeah, thank you. I really I read through the chat, and there are a lot of great questions, and it fits also really well, Lana, with what you said about higher education institutions being gatekeepers. I think that has a lot to do with the way we speak to learners and who do we want to reach. Yeah. It can be really simple. You have a website, and each university has for example, has a policy and has a regulation of RPL of how to validate non-formal and informal learning. There might be possibilities, but it's just not talked about. It's not visible. Yeah, and that's what we see a lot. That there are somewhere in the policies, there's something in place because maybe there's a legal obligation, maybe there's a political will that there should be something in place. And then when the quality assurance agency comes, they say, yes, accreditation, we do have policies in place, but are they also lived? And I think that's the important point to say, if you want to live them, if you want to make them reality, then you have to use a language to communicate clearly and transparent in order to reach the people. I did see another question on digital tools, and there's an example came to my mind that connects those two points, that you can explain the same terms with different language to the different stakeholders. And the RPL expert I mentioned in my presentation, Susanna Baldrino, she's actually working on that, like how to use language. And with the help of AI, it's really easy to just say, a difficult term like validation. What does that mean? Why am I doing this? What is the benefit? Explain it to a teacher, explain it to a student, explain it to a learner, explain it to policymakers, yeah, and show the different benefit. And then you can use that in your promotion, for example, and the way how you talk to the ones you want to reach. But of course, the what an institution needs to know before is who do we want to reach, and that's the attitude and the cultural shift that is necessary, the commitment.
Thank you very much. Looking at the time, we have about 15 minutes left and a few more questions to get to. I missed who put their hand up first, Ernesto or Ossama.
I think Ossama should go first, because I have already talked.
Okay. Regarding your question about the need and how to motivate the individual to go for the processes here in Egypt are demand driven. Simply, if you don't have a literacy certificate, you don't have the possibility to work in a formal work or even to have a driving license. To enter a school after you lose your age of a few years passed out of the school, to return to the school, you have to have a leveling exam to know where to put yourself inside the school, the level you enter or the class you enter. On the other hand, if you need to maximize as a state, to maximize the benefit of the skills available in your community, or if even enhancing the level of skills are part of your lifelong learning strategy, as the one we have in Egypt, you have to announce and to make the individuals in the community know. To enhance your level in the work, you have to pass. You have to gain a certain amount of skills to go for this job, to go for a promotion or something like this. This is exactly what happened in Egypt.
Thank you. Ernesto, did you want to comment?
I wanted to comment on the communication and kind of, if I may, just to kind of, if you want, complement what Agnes and Ossama were saying, because in addition, I agree, like the language is very important. The certificates, the demand, let's say, on the labor market needs. But I also thought, and we emphasize this quite a lot, is that the community. So what we say a lot is the NGOs and civil society organizations have a big role to play in getting to those people that we want their knowledge, their skills recognized. So I think that involving, as I say, these community groups, and I think there was a very interesting example in the Biennale, where in Canada I have done a lot of this, bringing some of the indigenous communities to some university. I can't remember now exactly, but it was a very interesting example where you are kind of making sure that those working or NGOs, civil society organizations that are working with that community can, make sure that they participate in outreach measures. So I think that's an important element of the communication.
Yeah, just quickly, and I'm just breaking every rule here of moderating a discussion. It might have been our school, Thompson Rivers University. We've been working with Indigenous communities to deconstruct PLAR back to its absolute most basic forms. And in that, we've taken it back to the surfacing of the learning, the reflecting on the learning, the sharing of the learning, and the validation or the recognition of that learning. We worked with community for them to tell us how to best work with their community members to surface and to reflect on that learning, and even how to recognize it or validate it. And we've had the first handful of students go through, and just very proud to say one of the elders received his entire 3rd and 4th year university credits through this process with the community guiding it. So when you talk about, somebody earlier had mentioned the power and giving power up, we did that completely, and it came, the learning that came back to for the communities and for us was profound. And so thank you for letting me share that. Next, I wanted to go to, in the chat, there was 2 kind of streams most recently around professional development and artificial intelligence. So I'm going to start with a question for any of the presenters around professional development. So if we think about why are we doing recognition, and we look at it from the learner's perspective, the organization's perspective, the government's perspective, society's perspective, how do we help the practitioners that are doing this work to be more open-minded, to understand the power that they hold, and to understand that the power they hold, and to bring some of those people on the peripheral of existing power structures, bring their learning to the surface. So what sort of professional development or learning would help with that? And this is open to everybody. Lana, yeah.
Yeah, maybe if I could even just take it a step back. I do some work in relation to Indigenous content requirements, and this is something that comes up a lot. So I think as a first step is really thinking critically about the role of professional development, because professional development often gets used as a way to maintain control, right? So we have an Indigenous content requirement specialist. Our faculty member has met with them 3 times to work on their syllabus. We don't need to hire more Indigenous faculty, right? So just kind of really being critical of the way that works, and then thinking about the key objectives. Like for me, it's significantly easier to maybe train someone up in technical skills related to PLAR versus trying to expand someone's worldview. So the importance of Indigenous representation, diverse representation, again, partnership, and also seeing those types of capabilities as being core in hiring processes. So totally skirted the question, Susan, about what exactly is needed for professional development, but also, yeah, just kind of thinking about that, and always thinking critical, is that kind of the best approach to move forward.
Yeah, thank you. Any, yes, Agnes, yeah.
Yeah, I understood the question more a bit, if how to professionally develop and what development do practitioners, validators in higher education, in institutions need? I'm not sure if you meant that, but I like the comment in the chat that I think teachers should undergo an RPL procedure themselves. Of course, coming from a networks perspective, what we do is support peer learning amongst also the higher education professionals, practitioners, validation practitioners, and for example, facilitate study visits to also go to other countries and learn from other perspectives, of course, yeah.
Yeah, what a great suggestion to facilitate study visits. And I think most people on this webinar would agree that back to Alan Tuff's research way back in the 70s, that about 70% of what we learn is by doing. So that experience, which is, you know, what we all do in practice or policy or in principle. 20% is through chats like this, by adding to our understanding with other people that can help us stretch our knowledge. And then about 10% is through the formal. So yeah, I really like that. Following that in the chat as well, that suggestion around we do the work ourselves that we're asking others to do. We have a few minutes left, 5 minutes left. I'm vacillating right now because AI is such an important topic to discuss. Maybe that can be an upcoming webinar, and how we can use AI to support inclusion, to support some of that power, to give that back to the communities, back to the displaced people that we're working with. And Nan, I'm going to go to some of the research that you've done. I should have brought this image, but Nan has been presenting in the last few years on assessing what we cherish. And for me, what really resonated there is in many of our traditional ways of assessment, we assess what we think is important, and it's a very small piece of the knowledge that learners have. And once we start including other voices, and that was in the chat as well, having the users help us design the programs, the policies, the practices that we use. Once we expand that understanding and we look for ways, for frameworks, for systems that can assess knowledge in bigger realms, I think we'll have a much more inclusive and accessible RPL program that'll be more inclusive and more accessible, and that'll support all of our goals around the individual, around the organization, around the governance, and around socialization. Nan, Alan, Carl, and do you want to add any final words? I do have a quote that I'd like to end on by the Biennale, by Ted, if he's still with us.
We have a couple more slides, so why don't you do the quote, Susan, and then we can go to that.
Yeah, thank goodness the quote's really quick. It's by Axel Horneth's theory of recognition. And if we just go right back to the absolute basics, that recognition is a basic human need. Our keynote, Ted Fleming, at the Biennale conference in Kilkenny shared that. And I think in all of the talk around power, legislation, culture, reconciliation, relinquishing power, the objectives of why we're doing that, if we keep at our core that recognition is a basic human need, and how do we do this with equity and inclusion, we're working in a good direction.
Thanks, Susan. Thank you so much. Thanks, Alexa, for this next slide. We are back for one moment to Pleo and the journal. The next two issues that we're working on, I think, are intimately connected to some of the themes that were raised in these wonderful presentations today. Our upcoming issue is on PLA responses to urgent social realities, specifically focusing on refugee, migrant, displaced, and stateless people. Our next issue beyond that is specifically focusing on human resources and labor market development. There's more details on the site about those calls, but we welcome your comments, ideas, resources that we could include in these upcoming issues. Alexa, the next slide. This is something that we brought up at the very beginning of our meeting today. We had a wonderful, as Nan pointed out, a 5th VPL Biennale in Kilkenny with support from our terrific Irish colleagues, which was actually an interesting collaboration between the United States, Canada, and Ireland. We are looking for individuals, organizations, institutions who might be interested in contributing to the planning and facilitation of a new Biennale, hopefully in a year from now. And if you have any interest, any questions, even titillations about doing this, please send us a little note to PLA-insideout@sunyempire.edu. We'd love to talk to people. We're excited about very much about this happening. And finally, thanks a million. Thank you especially to our wonderful 4 guests, Agnes, Witzani, Lana, Ossama, Saleh, and Ernesto Villalba-Garcia for helping us today. A recording of this meeting will be on the PLAO website, plao.org, in the coming days. And we look forward very much to having a webinar twice a year. Our next one will be in the fall. And with the help of our advisory board, we'll be shaping whatever topic we will focus on. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and to our guests and to our community. We look forward to further conversations. Thanks a million to all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for hosting.
Mi
Thank you
gwech,
very much.
gwabnamin.